Travel, trade, transportation. As America began to evolve, the need for development and expansion in these frontiers grew at an increasing rate. The Transcontinental Railroad was a milestone in the field of transportation and a major catalyst for westward expansion. But a miraculous feat such as this is not uprooted on its own. This is the story of the man behind the scenes who persevered and made a seemingly impossible dream into a reality.
Before 1836, most people couldn't imagine a world where goods such as coffee, textiles, clothing, and essentials like flour and other food staples could be accessed on a regular basis. Other things, such as medical necessities, were also not available to the American man. The trade system from the east to the west was almost non-existent and definitely inefficient. Besides the Pony Express, there was no fast way to deliver mail and supplies from one end of America to the other. But thanks to a few men, including Theodore Judah, this would soon change.
On March 4, 1826, Theodore Judah was born to a family in Bridgeport, Connecticut. He studied civil engineering at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, the first private engineering school in the world. And by the age of 18, he had become a railroad surveyor. Before he began working on the Transcontinental Railroad project, he had worked for 3 other railroads, planned and built the Niagara Gorge Railroad, helped construct the Erie Canal, and built a large bridge in Vermont. That bridge is still standing today.
Judah's roaring ambition and enthusiasm gave him the nickname of Crazy Judah. He dedicated his life and career to the expansion of the railroad. He and his men had already built the first railroad west of the Missouri River by 1856. A year later, he also published a small book called A Practical Plan for Building the Pacific Railroad on January 1, 1857. In this book, he outlines his plan for building the railroad and even goes so far as to map out salaries for future railroad workers. With the determination and grit that Judah showed, it was certain that the railroad would be completed. Work began in 1863, and thanks to Judah's careful planning, it began to pick up steam.
Who is Theodore Judah?
Theodore Judah, from Connecticut and from upstate New York. He was trained in Troy, New York as a civil engineer, went west and became the first railroad engineer on the Pacific Slope for the Sacramento Valley Railroad. And it was he who decided to tackle the notion of a transcontinental railroad from its most impossible side, which was the western side. How to get from the Sacramento Valley 7,000 feet up to the summit of the Sierras, and then down in some kind of a stately manner down into Nevada. And he crisscrossed all over the mountains until he found the old Donner route. The old Donner Party route, which had collapsed in starvation and hunger years before, and it was also a perfect route for a railroad, a nice, easy, continuous divide from the valley up to the summit and then back down again.
To advertise to potential investors, Judah would go city to city in California and throw his pitch for the new railroad. At one of his presentations in Sacramento, he caught the attention of a store owner named Carlos Huntington. Huntington invested $1,500 before bringing in 4 more investors who did the same. $1,500 in 1860 was about the equivalent of $53,000 in current day. Thus, the Central Pacific Railroad Company was formed by Mark Hopkins, Leland Stanford, Charles Crocker, James Bailey, Carlos Huntington, and Theodore Judah. He then headed to Washington, where he was able to convince congressional leaders as well as President Abraham Lincoln to sign the Pacific Railroad Act into law the following year.
Although on the outside it appeared that the Central Pacific Railroad Company was a perfect pairing of like-minded individuals, the investors had their share of arguments among each other, and especially Judah. It began with disagreements about how the railroad was to be engineered and escalated to fights about business ethics. Judah, though grateful for their contribution to his project, decided he had had enough of the original investors and their bickering drama.
In hopes of finding new investors to buy out his current partners in California and to see his wife for the first time in many months, he began his journey eastward in October of 1863. He traveled by ship to the Isthmus of Panama, but had to cross the isthmus by foot, for the Panama Canal had yet to be built. This, however, was a fatal mistake. On his journey, he contracted yellow fever, one of the many illnesses that had crept its way through the South, killing most of its victims and only leaving behind a small number of survivors. Unfortunately, Theodore Judah was not one of those lucky enough to beat the odds and overcome this illness. Judah died on November 2, 1863, without seeing the completion of his greatest dream. Ironically, if the Transcontinental Railroad had been finished at the time he had fallen ill, he could have been transported to a hospital containing the medical advances to save him. 68 years later, on February 25th, a monument honoring the work Judah helped complete was unveiled at Sacramento Municipal Park. Fittingly, the memorial to the pathfinder of this railroad was placed across from the Southern Pacific Railroad station.
The Transcontinental Railroad was constructed over a 7-year period. It involved moving hundreds of thousands of tons of rock by hand in extremely dangerous blasting procedures. The railway wound through mountains and over steep gorges and hills. These men, who had come from many parts of the world, constructed massive bridges and snow sheds to make it possible. Because of their dedication, they completed unheard-of tasks, such as drilling tunnels into mountains that were covered in 30 feet of snow, chiseling through miles of solid granite, and laying 10 miles of track in 12 hours. It was, and still is, an extremely impressive feat considering the equipment and resources available to them at the time. Once completed, it became an aid to America as they were recovering from the Civil War. It cut travel time across the continent from several months to around a week. It helped thousands of people get the supplies they needed for everyday life and boosted trade between the East and West by well over 100%. It was a marvel to behold and also placed America at the top of the industrial age. Without Theodore Judah, this magnificent American wonder would have never been able to exist.
It built America. It brought millions of immigrants. Any town, you go to Kansas Pacific. Look, running from Kansas City all the way across Kansas. It was Kansas Pacific, owned by the Union Pacific, Missouri Pacific. Those towns would not have existed without them.
Thanks to Theodore Judah's meticulous planning and investment in the Transcontinental Railroad, it was completed on May 10th of 1869. Officials from the Union Pacific and Central Pacific Railroads came together to drive a ceremonial gold spike, which was later removed and replaced, to signify the completion of the railroad. It was memorialized in the famous photograph taken by Andrew J. Russell. Because of the completion of the railroad, traveling from coast to coast was made significantly easier and safer.
Theodore Judah was an entrepreneur whose quick wit and adventurous spirit brought the idea of a transcontinental railroad to life, which in turn helped the new frontier of westward expansion in the everyday lives of fellow Americans. The Transcontinental Railroad made a huge impact on the world of transportation and proved that a 2,000-mile-long railroad track was even possible. Today, the majority of the Transcontinental Railroad is still in use and provides thousands of Americans with employment. It is one of the greatest wonders that our country has ever seen and could not have been completed without the help of Theodore Judah, a true pioneer.